Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Lebanon. Now, Saad al-Hariri has once again become prime minister in that country. That, of course, his cabinet, I believe, has to be approved at some point in time within the next few days or so. Nevertheless, for him to be back in power, even though he had resigned at some point when the protests began last year, does this really make sense? Is this going to help Lebanon going forward? I mean, there's a lot that's happened, right, over the past year. We've had those protests against corruption in the governing system, et cetera, and then we had the Lebanon, or more specifically the Beirut blast that happened as well. All of the above, of course, indicative of the political crises that the country has been going through for a while now, in fact, because, again, of the governing system and many of the legitimate grievances against that. Does it make sense for him to be back in power? Should we give him a chance? Can he do better this time around? He has promised a cabinet of non-partisan experts. Is that even possible in a system like Lebanon at this point? Let's discuss all of that a bit further with our guests who are joining us. Both of them are joining us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. We're joined now by Dr. Naeem Joseph Salem, who is a professor of international affairs and diplomacy. And we're also joined by Ayman Mhanna, who is executive director of Samir Kassir Foundation. Ayman and Naeem, thank you both for your time today and for joining us here in Scope. Ayman, what are your thoughts about this? I mean, again, from the outside in at least, this seems like we're sort of back at square one. We have the same men, in this case, one man coming into power who, again, is very much part of that old system.
We are back at square one. Over the last year, in spite of the demonstrations, in spite of the grievances that the Lebanese people have expressed at many occasions, whether in October last year, throughout also the cabinet of caretaker Prime Minister Hassan Diab, and after the Beirut explosion on August 4, a very important dynamic took place. On the one hand, the discourse, the general discourse of the protesters, aiming for better governance, calling for the end of corruption, has become a mainstream discourse. It's no longer only limited to the fringes of Lebanese protesters coming from progressive urban circles. It's become a nationwide discourse. It's become an international discourse. However, that discourse always and consistently failed to translate itself into a political proposal that represented a credible alternative for the Lebanese public, but also for the international partners of Lebanon. So we see we're back to a situation of dichotomy between, on the one hand, a general approval that things cannot continue as usual, at the same time, a complete failure to translate this situation into a political alternative. And this was the ideal scenario for the traditional political class to recollect its powers, to recollect its old ways of doing politics, and bring Saad Hariri back. And it was also a signal that back in 2009 and early 2020, it was not possible to only push for the resignation of the Prime Minister while the Speaker of the Parliament and the President of the Republic remain in place. We cannot fight a political system, the sectarian political system, by only targeting one position. Right. Probably now is the time to rethink what we did over the last year and understand the limitations of only targeting one position while two other very traditional representatives of that system are still in place with no plan to be replaced in any foreseeable future.
Naeem, what are your thoughts on this? I imagine there's a lot of room for pessimism here, right? As I said to Ayman, it seems we're back where we started.
Well, our system in Lebanon, particularly since early 1990, has been very much predominantly influenced by foreign powers and foreign countries, far away powers and regional states. We are located in an unstable and combustible neighborhood, and the interventions of the various powers in our affairs have been big and great and negative. For the most part, they have been negative. The primary factors which has brought prime ministers and presidents in Lebanon into power and into their positions have been foreign influences on us. We don't want to fool ourselves and say our democracy is bringing about these prime ministers or the President Aoun, who had and has his own support base in Lebanon. He was prevented from becoming a president after returning from exile in 2005 until there was an acceptance, regional acceptance by the Saudis and international acceptance by the American for him to come to power. Right. After he assumed the presidency 4 years ago, obstacles have been put in his face and continue to be put. He has brought a platform of reforms which he wanted to implement. The various political groups and interest groups which have been in power since 1990, before he came, have laid had put a lot of obstacles in his way to implement any reforms. And this is the major problem. The fact that Mr. Hariri now has been brought back to head a new cabinet indicates that our system is in a gridlock. Okay. Our system is not functioning
and that's a very good point there, Naeem. Ayman, I wonder, if we're to be completely fair, right, it would be really hard, and I think we've had this conversation before too, about the change in the system that Lebanese want to see, right, eventually, that needs to be gradual, right? It needs to be a step-by-step process. I mean, obviously this will not occur overnight. You can't just snap your fingers and all of the above change, right, in one go. How does one do that realistically and slowly in a logical fashion? And then there's also major issues that the country is facing, right? I mean, we are all in the middle of a pandemic, so every country around the world is having their own respective economic issues as well because of this. So how does one deal with all of the above? I mean, this seems like a monumental task for anybody to take on. Isn't there then some credit to be given in some ways actually to Hariri to say, okay, at least he's trying to in some ways do what he can possibly?
I'm torn apart between directly answering your question and only replying to Dr. Salem. Okay. I unfortunately do not see that President Michel Aoun brought a reform agenda was prevented from the other political class. Actually, the disappointment was the dichotomy again between former opposition leader Michel Aoun and President Michel Aoun. He enacted with his political party a policy that resembles, like two peas in a pod, the same clientelistic way that every other political party in the system has done, with a level of repression of freedom of expression. This is my specialty. The numbers under the presidency of Michel Aoun, compared to any presidency before that, even during Syrian occupation, are dismal and catastrophic when it comes to the governance of President Aoun, alongside everyone else. So I'm totally in support of the slogan, everyone means everyone, and the president being on top like everybody else. So going back to the point about the path for reform, it's monumental, and I'm extremely pessimistic because we cannot expect any person from that political class, neither President Aoun nor Prime Minister Hariri or anyone else, from actually enacting reform. Their own survival is dependent on their clientelistic network within the system. Their own funding is dependent either on foreign funding for some, or on tapping into government contracts. So if we ask them to reform, we ask them to commit suicide. This is why the only chance we have now is for, on the one hand, those who demonstrated over the last years focus on organizing themselves politically in the best and smartest way so they can contest the next elections, and the international community must maintain unbelievable level of pressure on our political class to condition any aid to a very strict adherence to a program of economic, social, and governance reform. If the two pressures, the local one and international one, wane or are reduced even a bit, it's recipe for a complete disaster, even worse than the collapse we've been going through so far.
So Naeem, I don't want to get bogged down with specifics about names, right? So I don't want to just, concentrate, for example, on Michel Aoun. Of course, I mean, it's important to talk about each individual as well within the system, but do you agree that the system, as it currently stands right now, the governing system in Lebanon does need to change? Because, the sectarian quotas, all of the above, those are all cited as areas where reasons for the fact that we're seeing so much corruption, that we have seen so much corruption in all these years?
Definitely, the sectarian, corrupt system has been a cumbersome system, and all attempts at reforms in the system have been brought to dead ends. And the past year's so-called revolution in Lebanon has been more than 80% foreign instigated revolution by foreign powers and by local parties in Lebanon. In Lebanon, the factors which direct the political system have been for a long time foreign factors, particularly since the civil war started in 1975 until the present, and they continue to be. Our period of golden independence in Lebanon is between 1958 and early 1970s. This is a golden area during the President Fouad Chehab, where our own affairs were mostly decided locally. Afterwards, since the war, our destiny have been splintered between regional power and international power, including Israel, the United States, Syria, Iran, etc., etc. And those various powers, some of them waned and waxed in their intervention, but still, overall, we are under the mercy of massive foreign intervention by foreign power. Anyone who says that this revolution, which was ignited on 17 October of last year, was entirely directed by local factor, really is duping himself and duping the audience. This is not quite true. To one extent, it is, but the revolution was hijacked by political parties who have been in power for the past 30 years, and now after the revolution they come to claim we are for reforms. Man, why didn't you do reforms since 1990, 92, when U.S. moved to power all throughout the 1990s and the 2000 and 2010? Now you're coming to tell us about reform? What have you been doing all of these 30 years? I'm talking about all of this political establishment. This is the dire reality in Lebanon. Political claims and counter claim. Michel Aoun came to the scene just 15 years ago. After he returned from exile, and he hasn't been able to do much because of all of the obstacles. He has a group in parliament, less than 29 or 27 parliamentarian deputies out of 130. Right. And therefore, he hasn't been able to make the wheels of reforms turn in the right direction, unfortunately.
Okay, so the point that I'm hearing from that Naeem is making, and I think it's a legitimate one, is that the Lebanese should be in the driving seat here, right? They're the ones who should be the main ones who are ensuring that their country's national interests are being met, that their own interests are being met. Yes, of course, we have a lot of these foreign powers who have significant influence in various different parties, so we can name and list probably all of them, but I don't want to get into those specifics. Nevertheless, in general, if we're speaking, how does one ensure then that it is Lebanese who are carrying this forward? Because, even with the French involvement, as you well know, Ayman, there was concern about, how France would obviously do what's in its interest. I mean, that's just the natural way of how things work. Every country that would come into Lebanon would want to see that its interests are met, that it gains something out of the situation. How does one ensure that Lebanon gains at all times?
These people are divided today between those who support the establishment parties, all of them, and those who don't. Both sides constitute Lebanon and have to be in the driver's seat. On the side of those who consider themselves in the opposition, I'm not talking about parties who were in power and suddenly are in opposition today. I'm talking about the people outside the system. They need to organize politically, and there are recipes for that in terms of working on developing common platforms, working on smart electoral and media and communication policies to contest the next elections. Those who are in power today, Mr. Aoun, Mr. Hariri, everybody else, Mr. Jumblat, the Lebanese forces, Hezbollah, and the Speaker's party have to actually stop finding excuses that nobody can believe, that everybody claims to be a reformist and accuses everybody else to prevent them. This has to stop. The path for reform is clear. Are we ready to enact the independence of the judiciary law, draft law that is today in Parliament? Stop finding excuses, vote on it. Are we ready to enact the new independent media law that is today in Parliament? Do it. Are we ready to give the audit court, the central inspection and all the oversight bodies full power to investigate every act of corruption without finding excuses and trying to find fake balances between cases? So let's stop the kind of BS that we've been hearing as Lebanese from all these parties, complaining about the others and then signing partnerships with them to be in joint governments. This has to stop. Let's stop fooling ourselves, because all these parties that are in power are in fact only interested in maintaining the same corrupt model and disguising themselves by criticizing the sectarian system. And suddenly, when anyone criticizes them, they come to us. Why are you attacking the Christian representative? Why are you attacking the Shia representative or the Sunni representative? And they act like sectarian entrepreneurs who always try to move some words that in our collective subconsciousness trigger some sectarian feelings in order to protect themselves from accountability. Reform starts with accountability. Accountability starts with what happened on the August 4 Beirut blast. All of them knew that there was nitrate of ammonium. All of them protected the corrupt leaders of the port. Some of them belong to Aoun's party, some others to Hariri's party, some others are protected by Hezbollah. They have all contributed to killing 200 people. Without accountability, nothing works. So show us that you are ready for any kind of reform. Stop the discourses, sign a government fast, enact it, and get to work. The country cannot wait anymore.
Naeem, I'll give you the final word. So we just have about a minute and a half left. Are you pessimistic? Are you optimistic going forward about Hariri and what he will be able to achieve? As I said in my introduction, he has promised he will bring in a cabinet of non-partisan experts. Is that even possible? Because as you know, as we've understood from the both of you, is that it's really hard to get beyond the sectarian system and this quota system that is in place. I mean, everybody has a political leaning. Everybody has those emotions in place because of their faith, etc., that is connected to all this. Will anyone be able to move beyond that at this time?
No doubt that the main obstacle for reforms and change in Lebanon is the detested sectarian system. But ever since this President Michel Aoun came to power 4 years ago, he has been seeking tooth and nail, first of all, to reform the judiciary, and he hasn't been able to pass his proposals and laws in Parliament. He wanted to reform the central bank and bring accountability to the central bank and how the money has been managed in the country and the banking sector has been managed. He hasn't been able to do that. The governor of the central bank, who was brought by Mr. Hariri, the former Hariri, the late Hariri, to power in 1992, promised the Lebanese in March that he will investigate who siphoned off the money from Lebanon between 25 and 30 billion dollars. They opened the banks during the revolution, during the demonstration, when everything was closed. They opened the bank for them, those aristocrat, big bureaucrat, to siphon the money and take it outside the country. And from March till now, the central bank governor hasn't told us, and he sure knows, hasn't told us who siphoned those 25 to 30 billion dollars outside the country. Hard currency, much needed hard currency, and that was one major cause of the collapse of the political system and the banking system, of the economic system and the banking system in Lebanon.
Right.
If we want to stay with these kinds of bureaucracies in the government, it is very difficult to do any reform in the country, unfortunately, any reform.
Okay. There's a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate both Naeem and Ayman for their time today. Of course, you know, it seems that there are, of course, disagreements about how exactly to go about reforming this system in place, but everyone agrees that that needs to still happen, that this system is not working, has not worked for Lebanese or in Lebanon's favor, that there are, yes, a lot of foreign influences. No one can deny that on the country at this point in time, that these politicians who have been in place in all these years, and of course, we're generalizing here, I'm sure there are many good within within the system as well, possibly in the lower levels, who are possibly trying to do the right thing for their country. But Lebanon, like many other countries around the world, is grappling with how it can ensure, and Lebanese, I should say, the Lebanese nation is trying to grapple with the fact that they need to ensure their own national interests are preserved at any given point in time, and how exactly to do that. At the same time, reforming a system which they do not like and which they know does not work for them, but has been in place for so long that it's almost already engraved in people's hearts and minds as well. Because as Ayman there said, there are a lot of emotions connected to when you talk about faith. If you bring that sort of thing in, then and it's very hard to then move on to the next step of ensuring that your country and its national interests are also preserved at that time. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Iraq. Now, the Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, has made quite a dire statement, and I'm going to quote him directly now. He has said that I am on a rope between two tall buildings. I'm not required to walk on the rope, but to ride a bike on the rope. I dance on a daily basis with the snakes, but I'm looking for a flute to control the snakes. Now, that's a long-winded way for the Prime Minister to essentially say that he's trying to balance Iraqi relations with both the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran is, of course, an important neighboring country. The United States is an important global power, and Iraq needs to certainly have balanced relations with both of the above. How exactly will al-Kadhimi be able to achieve that, if at all, and have past prime ministers even tried to do that? Is it even possible to do that, especially in the wake of what happened with Qasem Soleimani and then the fallout from that? All of this, of course, playing out on Iraqi soil, which has very much become the setting for the battle between Iran and America. We know the Americans threatened to completely pull out staff from their embassy as well, and that was seen as something that would possibly mean a further war with Iran on, again, Iraqi soil, and the Iraqis were worried about that as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Zana Gulmohamad, who is a researcher and columnist on Middle Eastern affairs, particularly Iraq. He's joining us today from Sheffield. Zana, thank you very much for your time today. What do you make of al-Kadhimi's statement? I mean, I imagine that this is probably the most direct statement on this issue that an Iraqi leader has made.
Yes, that's correct. He mentioned several similar statements on several occasions. However, this statement, it's quite obvious he's trying to paint a picture about the complications and the complications he is facing in Iraq. So just to put it a little bit in context, that Iraqi Prime Minister al-Kadhimi, he is facing pressure from inside, in particular the Iraqi political factions. And if we talk about the Iraqi political factions, we are talking about the powerful Iraqi political factions, including, for example, Fatah Alliance, which is considered pro-Iranian factions, as well as al-Sadr, Muqtada al-Sadr's factions, as well as other factions, coalitions and factions that put pressure on him in order to pursue their interests, the factions' interests. Nonetheless, he's trying to keep a balance between their interests as well as the global powers' interests. We are talking about the United States. And this is a very difficult task to execute. And he is lucky because he is not affiliated to any political party. However, he doesn't have a lot of power, constitutional powers, in order to execute those policies. As you know, Iraq is parliamentary political system, and the parliament holds a lot of powers. During the US's maximum pressure against Iran, he tries to maneuver and tries to negotiate between both factions, Iraqi factions as well as the global powers, in order to find a solution or to find a pathway or a roadmap in order to execute his reform plans. What he calls is often the white paper. He calls it the white paper, as well as but we should also bear in our mind that Iraqi Prime Minister al-Kadhimi, he is a moderate figure. He tries to keep all the actors, the powerful actors, in balance. And however, he's gently pushing against Iran, to be fair. He's gently pushing against Iran, but he's doing it diplomatically. But he also tries to galvanate the Western powers behind him simultaneously. And you have seen that he visited recently France, Germany, and then the United Kingdom. And in some way, he's trying to hint or indicate, I need the Western power support in order to execute my reform plan. And as you know,
on that point, Zana, I mean, I do apologize for interrupting you, but on the point of Iran versus the West when it comes to Iraq, do you think it's as simple as that dynamic? Because Iran is an important neighbor. I mean, it's right there, right? And it's huge and it's influential, and that's just a reality of life. And there's the religious connections. I mean, the list is endless of the connections between the two peoples. Certainly, Iraq still needs very good relations with Iran, right? And then also on the Western side, certainly Western countries, if they were to and are to help Iraq, they will always look out for their own national interests as well in any such deals. So when and how does Iraq ensure its own national interests regardless of Iranian influence or Western influence?
This is a very good question. Of course, it's not as simple. There are cultural links, religions links. As you know, the Shia sects are the majority in the middle and the south Iraq. And as you have mentioned, it is not as simple like that. But we should bear in our mind that also the Iraqi Shia religious figures, for example, Ayatollah Ali Sistani, he has different point views in regards to policy making, in regards to, although he's not intervening in politics, he has different positions and which are opposing positions towards the Iranian Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So therefore, there are also schisms or gaps between Najaf and Qom. So they are not on the same page. Therefore, many political factions in Iraq, for example, Ammar al-Hakim, the leader of al-Hikmah movement, he is closer to Najaf, Ayatollah Ali Sistani. And this is, although he respects Iran and the Shia figures, but he's following.
As a final point then, Zana, I'm going to go back to let's talk about the Western interests in Iraq, right? It can be argued, and I'm sure you may agree with this, that the system that we have currently in place, the governing system we have right now in place in Iraq is not working, right, according to many people. And that all is, of course, a result of the American involvement in Iraq since the downfall of Saddam Hussein. And, of course, the Americans were heavily involved in that. The coalition was involved in helping Iraq create the structure that is currently in place. Do you think that structure needs to be dismantled? Do you think that Iraq can blindly, if I may use that term, trust the Western countries to do what is right for it as well?
I think the political system in itself is the parliamentary political system. Theoretically, parliamentary political system, it should be a very successful political system. As you know, Britain is a parliamentary political system and many other democracies in the world. However, the problem we have, it's not the theoretical political system. The problem we have is the state institutions are not strong. The state institutions are dominated by political factions. There's corruption, and as well as the dominating factions, they are treating the state institutions as fiefdoms, that they are treating it as businesses or corporations, not as sovereign states or sovereign institutions. So the problem is with the treatment of those institutions and the behavior and the performance. Of course, the constitution needs change, or not a radical change. It needs reform. The state institutions needs reform. We need help and academy. He said that multiple times. We need the support from the international community as well as the United Nations in order to set up a more objective institutions. Nonetheless, I'm not saying we should dismantle the entire political system, but some of the behavior and the performance and the tendencies towards those institutions are not objective, and they are serving political factions' interests.
Very well. I believe there's a final word, Zana, but we really, really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us here in Scope. That was Zana Gulmohamad, Middle East expert, speaking to us there from Sheffield today, speaking about the Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi's statement about, how he is essentially trying to balance relations between the United States and Iran and the influence that both of those countries have over his country and affairs within his country. This is certainly not an easy balancing act because he does need relations, or good relations, as any country ideally should have with other countries around the world, including, of course, neighboring countries, those countries which have great influence over you because of cultural links, religious links, all of the above as well. How does al-Kadhimi do this? How will he be able to do this? Will he even be able to do this? I mean, is it even possible, since the very heavy American involvement in the country since the fall of Saddam, as well as the Iranian involvement, which was natural and expected to have happened, considering, again, as I said, the many links between the two peoples. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss Rohingyas and Myanmar, of course. And there is a donor conference currently occurring, I believe, as we speak. 35 civil society groups, though, have warned that it's not really up to donor conferences and just endless aid to be able to help the Rohingya. We actually need a much more permanent solution and a long-term solution. And this goes really to the heart of every such issue around the world. I mean, just throwing money at this problem will not necessarily have the long-term impacts that many think it will. Certainly, of course, it will make life better for the Rohingya, hopefully, that are stuck outside their country and or are IDPs or internally displaced people within Myanmar because the army has razed their homes down in Rakhine State and otherwise. But we need a permanent solution. We need to have pressure, more pressure on Myanmar itself to actually accept these people as its own citizens, as they are, as we all know. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Palash Kamruzzaman, who is a senior lecturer in social policy at the University of South Wales. He's joining us today from Cardiff. Palash, thank you very much for your time today. What do you make of this call? I mean, it makes sense, right, that aid is not enough at this point in time to resolve this issue?
I think it needs to be looked slightly differently, of course. Aid is important, as you say, for the survival of these vulnerable and persecuted people. Bangladesh will not probably host these people from its own fund, even though some donors are suggesting that they should take loan from the World Bank, for example, right? So aid is not that it's not less important, but I understand your perspective, which is more important. I watched the conference. The conference has taken place, and it seemed to me that it can be looked from three ways. One, this is a carrot to Bangladesh government, right? So donor communities are giving the carrot. And when I was watching the governments and the countries are pledging millions of dollars after dollars, I could sense that they are trying to buy some sense of guilt because they are not doing enough, as you said, for pressurizing Myanmar government to take their own citizens, right? And also they are feeling guilty because they are not taking, they know probably deep down in their heart that they are not taking enough strong action that will pressurize Myanmar to take back their own citizen and engage meaningfully to solve this crisis.
No, I agree with your point, of course, that there is a more balanced way to look at this. And certainly Bangladesh is doing, something very honorable by hosting all these people and needs all the support from the international community can get. But, I wonder if we're looking then at the ICJ case, right, the one that the Gambia has brought against Myanmar. Do you think that will then be the factor that will help finally resolve this issue? Is that even possible? Because it seems that Myanmar, the country itself and the establishment have been able to weather all of this pressure and still do essentially whatever they want when it comes to Rohingya.
Honestly, I am personally very doubtful, skeptical, because I have been researching this for a good couple of years about this issue, right? The ICJ, this is a lengthy process, and I do not think that international community will be able to force Myanmar. If they could, they would have now. Since they're not doing it now, right? So there are some implications of the case, and then there will be greater pressure on them. But what I think is the international international community is playing possum in a sense like, they are not paying right sort of attention. They're paying lip service to this crisis. And if you listen carefully, like even during that conference, the Bangladeshi state minister was telling that, like, look, take these people back, and that relieve us from this burden. And foreign minister of Bangladesh was like, trying to say, we do not need your aid. We will give you like an even more, we will still like send assistance if you take them back, if you take to your country. So no countries are taking these refugees. If you look at like in other neighboring countries, treatment of Rohingya is like much worse in those countries. And the international community is like quiet. They cannot pressurize those countries, right? Bangladesh, if you look at the stat, they have taken like 90 out of 100 Rohingyas. Those are like displaced on this at this moment, right? So it is like it is suffering from like social, ecological, environmental, and economic aspect. Why? And I do not understand why Rohingyas are like suffering too. The Rohingyas are suffering. Rohingyas are victim of something where they have not played any part. There is no fault of their own, right? So loser of this crisis is Bangladesh, and loser of this crisis is the host community, and the loser of this crisis is the Rohingya people themselves. And what baffles me is because this humanitarian aid, like I said, this is my footnote. It is extremely important that humanitarian aid flows better. Of course, there needs to be something. Yeah. Otherwise, survival will be hampered, right? But the case is, if you look deeply, this is a crisis which is not a humanitarian crisis. Nobody on this planet will say this is a humanitarian crisis. This is a political crisis. There are players who have created this crisis, and this demand a political solution. And a political solution needs serious international pressure from Myanmar. And Bangladesh government is rightly calling the international community, look, you are doing this humanitarian crisis as a lip service or as a show maybe, but you are also making business as usual approach with Myanmar. Exactly. You are having strong business ties, businesses increasing day by day. This is only emboldening Myanmar. If everything is normal, there is no pressure, why they will they will say, okay, we have made this mistake and we'll accept it back. It's not going to happen soon.
Exactly. So, a final comment before I let you go then, Palash. What happens next then, right? Because as more time goes by, I would imagine that this makes it that much harder for the return of the Rohingya to their own country, doesn't it? Then we need to start looking at permanent solutions about where these people are meant to go, because these are all human beings, right? If the Western world, if I may use that very general term, will not live up to its own ideals of human rights, freedoms, etc., and doing the right thing by these people because their own economic problems may not be allowing for that, and the anti-immigrant feelings that are growing in places like Europe as well. What happens to these people then? Will they remain in Bangladesh? Is that just now going to be their permanent home?
Well, there are rhetorics about that. Some people tend to propose so there are three different options. One is, of course, repatriation. One is, of course, having Rohingyas in many different countries. And the other option, some people try to say that, look, why don't Bangladesh have them? And Bangladesh is strongly opposing this idea. No. They are the host. They are living here temporarily. We have shown generosity to these people. Otherwise, these people would have been dead. So, long-term solution, I personally think that this is going to be protracted. This will be one of the classic example of protracted displacement. And it might become a security crisis within the region. And only then I think other people or other global players will take it seriously, and this crisis will take new turn. Let me explain why. Not many people are thinking what is the crisis, what is happening on the ground, especially the host community. Rohingyas have now totally outnumbered the host community in Cox's Bazar and Ukhiya. People are growing, I write in my papers like this, that the initial sympathy is turning into annoyance and hostility in many places. If you look at what happened in Moria recently, right, there is a claim that the host community have burned down the refugee camps in Greece, Moria, right?
Right.
Is it possible to have a harmonious relationship if host community and the government who is giving them shelter do go against these people? Just imagine if Bangladesh says, I do not care, let these people go wherever they want to go. They can travel to Saudi Arabia or America or Malaysia and other places. And then there is a fight or clash, conflict between the host community and these vulnerable people, which nobody probably want. Yeah. But if things protracted, as we are all human beings, like I said, and Bangladesh is also a state, it has its own politics.
Of course,
I'm sure that this will only go downhill if there is no genuine solution. And I think when this will get a new twist, a new dimension, you see this will be even more difficult to come up with a solution.
All right, Palash, leave it there at that, but we do sincerely appreciate your taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise with us on this issue. Yes, there are no easy solutions here, and yes, Palash is right to take the balanced view on that aid is also certainly very, very important, especially for host countries like Bangladesh, who have taken in so many of the Rohingya refugees that have had to escape from their own country, Myanmar, and the persecution they've faced there. But then, that can't be a permanent solution, right? Why is, if I may say, the rest of the world, the international community, which so says all over and over again that they're worried about the Rohingya, why aren't they actually pressuring Myanmar to the extent necessary to ensure that it does the right thing by taking in its own citizens? You would think that would be the easiest solution, right? But then, as Palash there said, it seems that everybody's just paying lip service, trying to pay to cover up their own guilt in this case, and we can probably list a whole host of countries, including the Western world and others, yes, as well. And at the same time, it's the Rohingya, it's the Bangladesh government, as well as others who are then suffering because the world is not willing to act to pressure Suu Kyi and the military establishment in Myanmar to do the right thing, to stop persecuting their own citizens for reasons that are just purely racist, really, if we're completely honest at this point in time. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.